So thank you everyone for dialing in today. My name's Will. I'm Sales Director at Threshold Sports, organisers of this wonderful thing we call Ride Across Britain. It's my pleasure to be moderating this training webinar this evening on group riding. So all about top tips, sharing best practice, enjoying the ride, but most of all, making sure you guys are super safe on what is a 9-day mammoth 980-mile journey. So hopefully that hasn't put you off, but without further ado, I think we'll go on to the next slide and cover off what we'll be talking about in this evening's session. So key topics are things like rider communication. So that's all the signals, the funny signals that you'll see, wondering what on earth they mean. We'll be talking about group size and ability. So everything from actually how to join a group, particularly if you're a solo rider on something like Ride Across Britain. You can be forgiven for feeling a little bit intimidated when you first arrive, but it's certainly not that kind of atmosphere on this event. So we'll be giving some good tips on how you can join certain groups and kind of stick with them. We'll then be going into a bit of detail around the safety element, which isn't a surprise, before we round off and give you guys all the resources that you need to make sure that you're fully informed and ready for the ride come September. There's going to be plenty of time for questions at the end. So what I'd say is if you could jot down any questions as we go, there is a chat function here. So if you just highlight at the bottom, open up chat, but importantly, instead of sending that question to Threshold Sports, if you could click on that and send that to me. So my name is Will Irwin. I'll be sure to read your questions out at the end. It is going to be a fairly interactive session, all anonymous, so please do get involved. But yeah, really designed just to go through the detail, kind of reassure you, and then leave plenty of time to ask the experts, which isn't myself, I might add. So before we crack on, I'd just like to make a couple of more introductions to our team. So we've got Sophie, who is our participant manager, who's making sure this is all running extremely smoothly, even though I might have jinxed that now. Sophie is our fountain of all knowledge on the event, so no doubt you'll probably be asking her questions over the next few months, and Sophie's team. So everything from what kind of snacks are at the pit stops to are the showers hot, and the answers to those are yes, the snacks are amazing and the showers are indeed hot. So that's Sophie. And then probably tee up next to Andy. So Andy Cook is our famous route director, British cycling coach. Again, fountain of all knowledge, not just on Ride Across Britain, but on cycling in general. So without further ado, I'll pass over to you, Andy, to get into the detail. And then I'll come back for the interactive sessions.
Thank you very much, Will. Welcome everyone to this session. I guess there's a little bit of mystique surrounding some of the signals, and that's pretty much because riders in different parts of the country use different hand signals. One of the most important aspects, I'm currently speaking to you from out in Mallorca. I'm looking after a whole load of rugby guys, including Jonathan Davis and Shane Williams. And I've just gone through all of this stuff this morning, so it's really, really hot topic for me, excuse me. But communication is key in anything like this, and the size of groups, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But passing the messages up and down the group are vital to make sure that the message does get through. So what you'll hear is people talking about a car up or a car down. Those are the old-fashioned traditional club cyclist calls. And then I hear you ask, well, what does car up or car down mean? There's a very crude way of describing what up is and what down is. It's down your throat, and then it's I'll leave you to think about the last one. But the easiest way, if you find that difficult to think about, is it's car back or car front. I find that much easier to use. So just call out, and then make sure that if someone at the front is calling out that there's a car front, that message then gets passed down the line. Similarly, if someone from the back of the group is calling car behind or car back, then make sure that message gets passed forward so that people at the front of the group are able to single out if necessary. So those are the two main things. But other things, of course, are things like obstructions beside the road, potholes. What you'll see is you'll see people pointing down towards a pothole, or you'll see people waving behind their back. This has become quite a common sign. So if people put their hand behind their back with their hand pointing to the right, so they use their left arm, that would indicate that they're going to move out because there's a hazard to go past on the left-hand side, and quite the opposite if there's a hazard on the right-hand side. Equally, as I say, some people will use point at a pothole or some gravel and also call out at the same time. One of the things I would always say about calls and about signs and signals is try not to be overzealous. You sometimes get people that are very, very enthusiastic about the calls and scream at the top of their voices, and that can be just as scary and off-putting as the actual hazard itself. So just make sure that the hazard that's being pointed out is called out in a way that's firm, that people understand what it is, and there's no ambiguity. I think that's the key thing here, to make sure that people really do understand what the hazard is. And the hazards can be various, but generally it's parked vehicles that you have to move around. It will be potholes, of which there are a significant number in the UK, as I'm sure you're all aware. And it might be grit or gravel that's been washed out due to heavy rainfall. The other things, of course, are white lines. White lines, if we've got rain or drain covers, if they're wet, they can become quite slippery. So those often get pointed out. And there are places, of course, where we go through towns where there's potential for pedestrians to be stepping out in front of the traffic. But so again, that's another hazard to make sure that you're aware of. On that slide, we've talked about lead cyclists and back cyclists. One of the things about a well-functioning group is that it would have a lead rider who essentially is, I guess, navigating or taking control of the group in that sense. And so if you're just coming together on something like Ride Across Britain, you might appoint someone. You might find there's a natural leader who seems to know the route, maybe has the route on the Garmin, is confident enough to take that role. But it's imperative that if you are in that position, that you are able to look over your shoulder, make sure that the group is staying together. Sometimes you'll get riders who will take the lead role, but actually they just ride off and leave the riders that are behind them in their charge, as it were, sort of floundering. Really good communication means that a group that's well formed will have a back marker. And so things that are very common and that need to be pointed out is this communication to be talked up and down the group. But when you get to junctions, particularly when you get to a junction, if the front of the group gets across a junction, and then a car's coming in the back of the group, doesn't get across, that the front riders are looking over their shoulders and they're easing up to wait short, or even stopping to wait to make sure that the rear of the group has got across the junction safely when it's safe to do so. And then the group reforms and off they go again. So that's kind of the main important aspects of rider communication. It's not rocket science. It doesn't need to have as much mystique surrounding it as people make out. It's just about calling out and making sure that people understand what those signs mean, and just be very clear. So as I said, don't use car up, car down if that doesn't mean anything to you. Car front, car back is just as straightforward. I know in Scotland they say car nose, meaning a car on the nose coming from the front. Again, confusing you, I'm sure. Okay, I'm happy with that slide. Moving on.
And Andy, just a question from me. What would you say is the kind of most common misconception when it comes to rider comms? Is there any kind of blatant ones which are always mistaken for something else?
I think if people often, it's a good question, Will. People get the car up and car down bit wrong, and they think that that's what they should be saying, which is why I just say car front or car back. I think that's much clearer. It's all very well and good, old-fashioned traditional cyclists who know exactly what they're talking about, but if it's just very confusing, and people often get it the wrong way around, very, very often. So as I said, car front, car back, or even just car, and allow people to work out which way it's coming themselves. Car's good enough for me.
That's good. Okay, so we'll go on to the first interactive part of this session. So guys, hopefully you can see two images there, image A and image B. In a second, you're going to have a poll flash up on your screen. It's all going to work very seamlessly. And yeah, you'll see a couple of questions there. So give you a little bit of time to have a look at this, answer what you think is right, and then we will share the results. So this is where I should have got a countdown theme tune going, but We'll just do that in my head. Great, very quick. I think we've got about 50 odd on this. So let's see if we can get everyone doing it. It's all anonymous, so don't be embarrassed. Looks like there's a few clear winners. Okay, giving up 10 seconds. And for those of you who haven't worked it out yet, you can move that poll around. So it is blocking the pictures, which isn't too helpful, but you can move it around. Okay, I think we are nearly there. So Sophie, shall we reveal the results? I did say it would work seamlessly. Okay, well, I'm seeing the results. Can you see that, Andy?
I can indeed. So I think 39 out of 41 people have got image A right. It is, of course, stopping. It was a new one on me, and I've been riding all my life. It's an interesting one. As I said earlier, we're currently out in Mallorca riding. The continental riders use this quite clearly, but it's a very good signal because you often are coming up to a junction and need to be looking forwards or looking right or left to see if it's clear to cross a junction. So raising your arm with your hand in a flat position is very clearly a sign for showing that you're going to stop. And so raising it high means that riders to the back of the group can see you as well. So yeah, I think nearly all of you have got that one right. It's really good to see that. I'm not sure the second one has been answered yet, Will. I've dragged my poll out of the way so I can see that image, but hopefully others can do the same and maybe start the poll again.
Yeah, I can see it. So 100% have gone in for turn right. For image B. So is that correct, Andy? Can you confirm?
Sorry, good show. I hadn't seen the bottom. Yeah, of course it is. It's absolutely right and proper. And it's interesting. I teach children bikeability at school, and it's very interesting the number of people, adults particularly, that you see making a right hand signal and they just drop their hand to the side of their thigh often and make a very sort of cursory sign. So a very clear indication that you're turning right. Is your arm outstretched and held for about 3 seconds, so it's clear to the rider behind or the drivers behind. That's what you're doing. Any other road traffic, that is what you're doing. But yeah, 100% right on that one. So excellent. Looks like we're all going to be in good shape come September.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide.
So, I mean, I think the question we often get asked is how easy it to find a group and how does a group form? You know, there's potentially 1,000 riders all setting off from Land's End on a hopefully a very sunny Saturday morning, as I said, in September. And what we tried to do at one stage is actually put up paddles so that people with speeds on, and the paddles had the relevant speed, and we had a 10-mile-an-hour speed and a 12-mile-an-hour speed and 14. The issue, of course, there is that people don't actually know what speed they're likely to ride in the terrain that they're riding. And trust me, Cornwall can be quite hilly, and actually group riding when it's hilly terrain, it's much less easy. And we'll come across a few slides where I can demonstrate that a bit more easily later on. But essentially, finding a group, it can be quite straightforward. It can be something as simple as just sitting at breakfast on that first morning or the night before. It might be that you're already riding with a group of friends. It might be that you're from a club. So don't be shy. There's quite a lot of opportunities on the forum for people, and I've already seen it, where people are asking for ride buddies, and the nucleus of a group is formed in that way. Bullet point 3 there is about the size of a group. For me, the ideal size group is around 8 to 10 riders. If you start to get many more riders than that in a group, then of course it becomes a little unwieldy. And inevitably what you'll then find is that you've got quite a range of ability levels, potentially. I mean, if you're in a professional cycling team, of course, you're all going to be at a certain level. But for something like the Ride Across Britain, that's unlikely to be the case. So once the group gets too big, any bigger than 8 to 10 riders, then you do run the risk of the group fragmenting the minute you start to go up an incline. So I think that for me, that's key. And of course, that kind of covers off the bullet point 2 there, which is about the ability level. So, be honest with yourself. What we sometimes find, of course, is that people who are perhaps a little nervous and maybe not as confident as they think they are will ride with a group, or a group that they think is going to go a bit more steadily. I hate to use the word slowly, but will ride at that sort of slower pace. And then, of course, they end up being the strong rider, and that has as big an impact in terms of someone splitting a group because they're too strong, and the slower riders then trying to keep up. So it's really, really important that you're honest with yourself when you're riding in a group. And if you, for example, start off riding in a group at the start of the day and you find that you're not feeling up to it for whatever reason, you might have not slept well, or you feel a bit off color, and you feel that you need to join another group or a slower group, then be bold enough to take that decision, because there's nothing worse than trying to keep up and using more energy than you should be using to keep up with a group that's too fast for you. So just be honest. And equally, as I say, don't try and be the big I am and go down and ride with a slower group just because it boosts your ego, because you're the strongest rider in that group. Unless, of course, you're strong enough to ride at the speed of the slowest rider. I've been cycling, as I said, all my life. And our club ethos was always the club rides you rode at the pace of the slowest rider in the group. So that's important that you get that bit right. I hope that sort of makes that group size and ability bit sort of clear.
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Andy. And for anyone that might have noticed the squiggly lines, I think Sophie was just getting creative with this slide. So please do not. Great. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide, which is your next poll, which will shortly be flashing up on the screen. It'll be worth the wait. Here we go. So which image illustrates the most appropriate formation to cycle in when riding with others? And again, you can move that. So if it's guarding the pictures. Bit more of a split on this one. That's what we want. Prompts discussion. Cool. It's like the Brexit vote. It's 40. Oh, that is close. Okay. Give another 5 seconds. It's nearly everyone. Okay. Oh, last one. Has that swung it? Okay, 2 seconds. There we go. So image B has been voted by a sliver, 51% to 49%. So Andy, can you elaborate on this one?
Yeah, of course. I think it's really interesting that the result has come out the way it has. And for various reasons, the little caveat, we weren't able I personally wasn't able to go through this as well as I might have done but I think that I was very happy with these two images, because what it shows is that there isn't a right answer per se. The image on the left is showing a couple of riders. We have to assume that they're riding two abreast there, although I would argue that it looks as if the right-hand rider is actually riding in an echelon formation, which would indicate that the wind might be from the left-hand side. I think one of the key things about group riding, in fact, the key thing about group riding, which we perhaps should have started off with in the intro, was that you will save, if you're riding in a group and taking the shelter from the riders in front, you will save up to 30% of the energy that's required to sort of push your way through the air if you're riding on your own. And so therefore, if the rider on the right, if the wind's from the left, he's taking a bit more shelter. And for those people who've raced will be fully aware of cycling is as much about saving energy as it is about using energy. So being smart and riding in a group is vitally important, in my opinion, and makes the whole experience so much more pleasurable. And that's important. The other shot is actually the group coming up Shap Fell, and I alluded to this earlier when I talked about the fact that when gravity is involved, some of us who are perhaps a few pounds too heavy, we suffer a little bit more than the racing snakes. And it would appear in this instance that you've got a group of around 6 riders there. Shap Fell, as you can see, is a long, steady gradient. Now, what I would hope would happen in this situation is the guy on the front is perhaps a bit stronger. The other four are sort of riding in formation behind each other, so they're getting a bit of shelter. And the guy who's just drifted off the back a little bit is perhaps finding the pace a little bit too tasty. Now, what would be really good in that situation is that when they get over the top, is that the guy at the front eases back a wee bit, the other four catch up, they all ease together a touch, and then the other rider comes out, and then they're back to their formation of 6 riders riding in unison and helping each other. So there isn't really a right answer in these 2 pitches, but what it has allowed us to do, as I've just mentioned, is to describe the benefits of riding a group and why riding a group is so important. You will get less advantage, of course, of riding a group on a climb, as I've said. But if you're on the flat, then it's, as I said, you're going to save 30% of the energy. And if you can share the pacemaking because the ability levels are the same, then you'll save a whole lot more energy. And as I said a minute ago, one of my favorite phrases, of course, is, as I said, is cycling's about saving energy. And the bike race, your Mark Cavendishes won't put his nose into the wind until the last 200 meters of a stage of the Tour de France for that very reason. So it demonstrates that in spades, in my opinion, those 2 slides. Very good.
Thanks, Andy. Go to the next slide.
So people who are, perhaps not used to riding a group, the first thing is people have lack of confidence potentially. What I would always say, I mean, if I'm riding in a group with my club mates who I've ridden with all my life, we'll sit very, very closely. When we used to race, our wheels are almost touching because we trust each other implicitly. However, if you're not used to group riding, then I would always suggest you leave a fair amount of space, maybe not quite a bike length, but not far off a bike length, to just give you a little bit of room should the rider in front do something that you're not expecting. What we notice always on RAB is that once the group riding techniques become established and people become more confident with the people they're riding with, then they actually do start to ride in a closer formation, which is really, really good to see. So you should be riding, perhaps half a bike length behind the rider in front. You need to be able to look beyond that rider, not just stare down at their back wheel or their brake bridge. You need to be anticipating what might be going to happen. So you need to be over their shoulders, beyond them, keeping an eye on them at all times, but also on other road users and making sure you can see what the terrain is and whether or not they're going to get out of the saddle, which often happens. And as people get out of the saddle, they ease the pedaling and their back wheel appears. It doesn't, of course, but it appears to come backwards a wee bit. So there's little things like that just gives you a little bit of rush room. Also riding next to each other. Once again, if I'm riding with my mates who I've ridden with for years, we can ride almost handlebars touching. I'm not suggesting if you're new to it that you do that immediately, but once again, we do notice that riders become much, much more confident with the riders they're riding next to. I mean, it's 9 days of riding. You do get familiar with these people, and that makes a big difference. But equally, in the first few days, and you're not comfortable, you ride where you feel most comfortable. That's the important thing. This event is about safety. It's about getting us to the finish. And as I said, by the time you get to day 9, you'll all be riding like professionals in the peloton. It'll be, I'm sure that'll be the case. Regrouping after junctions, I think I alluded to that earlier. One of the worst instances I ever saw was a massive group, much, much too big in my opinion. But the front riders went across a junction, a major road, and the riders behind just assumed it must be safe to go across because all the riders in front had gone across. It's a favorite phrase of mine. You have to take responsibility for your own actions. So make sure that you go across the road, making sure it's clear to go. Now, if you cannot go, then you hold back and you wait. As I said earlier, I think it was one of the first slides, the front riders, if they're good, should be looking over their shoulders as they've got over the junction to make sure that the riders that are behind have come across as well. If they haven't, they will just either ease off the pedaling or they'll pull in and wait for the riders to come across, depending on how busy that road is. So that would be my tip for regrouping junctions. Half wheeling is an interesting one. It's a phrase, again, another old-fashioned phrase, and it's an important one to bear in mind, because what you sometimes get is a little bit of competition, let's put it that way, going on in the group, and you'll find that riders that are at the front will start to what we call half wheel each other, whereas one of the stronger riders be that on the inside or the outside, will just ease their wheel forward a little bit because they're feeling a bit frisky. And then the rider that's riding alongside will try and match their speed and will try and line their wheel up with their wheel. And then they'll push in front again, and the pace of the group just gets faster and faster and faster until they're almost having a full-on race at the front. So it's really important that you ride at the pace together, a joint pace, and that you're not half-wheeling each other. Half-wheeling just destroys a group. In our cycling club, we actually have a half-wheeling trophy. It's not a good thing to be known as the champion half-wheeler, I can promise you. So just bear that in mind when you're in the group. If you're feeling strong, then ease back if you feel you're half-wheeling the rider that's next to you. If necessary, move groups and go and find one that suits your ability level. Feathering the brakes is another interesting one. There's some. And we have to use a wide choice of roads in this event, as you can imagine. So there's everything from big wide roads to very narrow lanes. And when I talk about feathering the brakes, I alluded to it a minute ago when I was talking about how close to ride. You should be able to look beyond the rider in front, to be prepared to just feather the brakes. And when I say feathering, that's just squeezing the brake levers just lightly, so you're just taking the speed off. Perhaps using slightly more back brake than front brake, so you don't slam the brakes on, and that will allow you a little bit of room to rush into if necessary. And the other thing about feathering the brakes is that when you're riding in a group, particularly on a single carriageway road, if a vehicle's coming towards you, more often than not, the instinct, of course, is to put the brakes on if you're riding two abreast. If you put your brakes on at the front of the group, the riders behind have to put their brakes on. And so before you know it, you're fanned out across the road, completely blocking the progress of the car that's coming towards you. So whilst it might appear counterintuitive, if the front riders actually speed up, the person on the inside ordinarily would be rider number 1. The person behind that rider would be number 3. And then 5 and so on. So the outside riders would be even numbers. If number 1 rider speeds up, that allows a space for number 2 riders to slot in. Does that make sense? So what we're looking at is an ability for the front riders, believe it or not, to just push on a little bit as a car comes towards you, to create a space for the back riders to slot into. And you can see there why a group of 14 or 15 riders, it doesn't work. If it's 8 to 10 maximum, then that works seamlessly. And again, if you're out with a competent group, they'll just do that seamlessly without hardly talking to each other. They'll just know that that's what's going to happen. So feathering the brakes to make sure that the riders at the back have got space to move into, front riders moving forward a little bit of space, is, as I said, a bit counterintuitive, but it works really well. So that's safety in the group, really.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. So time for our final poll of the evening. I hope everyone's been listening, because we're going to test you now. That should be appearing on your screen any moment. So here we go. So which image illustrates the most appropriate group size to ride in? And just remember, you can drag that away so it doesn't hide the image. It's good, very quick. We're nearly there. It's a lot more one-sided than the last one. Okay. Yeah, we're more or less there. So image A has got 95% of the vote, and then a small 5% for image B and nothing for image C. So over to you, Andy.
I think it's great, this one. I mean, we can't quite see whether image A is actually a line of 20 or 30 riders, but even so, I think the point that it demonstrates, even though they're riding single file at that point, and the other point that I haven't yet made is that if you're riding as a group of 8 to maybe 10 for a vehicle to pass, if you're riding two abreast, which you're quite legally allowed to do, it means the car's actually coming past, or a vehicle's actually only coming past 5 riders, as it were. And often when you're riding with new riders, if you're riding line astern in single file, more often than not, and if you're not used to the riders you're riding with, more often than not, people will just be overlapping a wheel. They'll be just riding outside the wheel. And if you're a car driver, and I'm sure many of you have witnessed this yourselves, and you come upon a group, it looks like a ragtag bunch of riders, all across the road, even though they think they're riding single file. So a really well-drilled 2 abreast, 8 to 10 riders makes it much easier for a vehicle to get past. As I said, Image A is the one we're going with, obviously, because it's that sort of size of number riders, with the caveat that there might be another 20 riders at the stern of that. Image C is something that we used to see a lot of, if I'm frank about it. We did used to see a lot of that type of riding. And there are certain areas on RAB where we do need to be very clear that that is just completely unacceptable, because we're just causing a real hindrance to other road users. Equally, I think that Image B is common on RAB, because we see riders that don't want to ride in groups, and there's nothing wrong with that. If people are happy to ride on their own or to ride with their mates, and that's all they want to do, then that's equally acceptable. We're not talking about people having to ride in groups. We're just trying to make it clear that if you do want to ride in groups, from a safety perspective and from a saving energy perspective, it makes such a massive difference. And I think, Tups will probably hear me say this. I used to have the Mickey taken out of me frequently by Threshold, because, chatting to your mates, whilst physically time doesn't pass any quicker, it just seems like it does, because you're being sociable and having a chat about whatever it might be, the football last night, or what that last climb was like, or what you had at the pit stop to eat, or whatever it might be. So, riding in company is just much more pleasurable, in my opinion, and you can share the experience whilst you're riding along. So there's loads and loads of benefits, in my opinion, to riding in groups. But equally, as I said, if people are happy to ride on their own or want to ride on their own because they don't want to do it, that's fine as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Andy. Go to the next slide. Okay, so along with kind of soaking up all of that information, and we're going to be shortly heading into the Q&A section of this webinar, just a reminder of kind of what's available to you from a resource point of view. So I'm sure many of you have had a nosy around the rider information platform. If you haven't, really recommend it. So you can get through to there via the FAQ section of our website. I'm pretty sure we share a link in every email that we send out as well. So here you've got everything from nutritional advice, kit lists, some of the things that Andy's mentioned, training guides, you name it, it's all there. And this is where we upload the recorded webinars. So this is being recorded. So if you've got any mates or any colleagues who haven't been able to make this one, you can direct them to the rider information platform, and we'll get that live in a week or so. We've also got the Facebook forum. I'm sure there's plenty of you who are kind of active on there. It's a very busy place, always fun, particularly in the build-up. This is perfect for, particularly when we're looking at group riding. If you're a solo rider and you're wanting to kind of hook up with people who are perhaps the same sort of level as you, or just simply are entering as a solo as well, it's really handy, particularly if you can organise some training rides in the build-up and you live in the same area. So well worth having a look in there. And then we've got a few more webinars coming up as well. Quite cryptic there on the 25th of May. More info coming soon. We're hopefully making an announcement there. Can't reveal anything more at this stage. For anyone who's doing a plus package, so for those of you who don't quite fancy camping under the stars, you want that comfort of a pillow and not hearing anyone snore, we are doing a plus specific webinar on the 9th of June. And the 11th of July is a pre-ride admin. And that's, if I was doing RAB, that's the one I would most likely be dialing into, because I know I suck at that, and I would need to tick off all the things I need to remember. So well worth dialing into those ones. So I think without further ado, we will crack on with the Q&A section. Just a reminder, if you've got any questions, and we've had a few come through already, which is great. If you open up the chat box and you click on to, and you change that to my name, Will Irwin, send your question through to me rather than Threshold Sports, just to make sure it gets through to me. So Andy, are you ready to be hit with a number of questions?
Go for it, Will.
Right, let's do it. So first one was from Ian. So are the changes to the highway code, with the changes to the highway code, are we encouraged to ride two abreast on the road?
That's a great question. Yes is the answer to the question. But I think that the important thing about that is that we need to remember that where we are on narrow lanes or busy roads, we need to be courteous to other road users, and we need to be ready to single file if that's necessary. And that we kind of touched on that. It's part of the communications bit. So if you're looking over your shoulder, you're the back of the group, and you see that there's a big build up of traffic, and it makes sense to single out at that point, call that out up the line, and then make sure you're singling out to allow the traffic to get past. But it needs to be safe to get past. So you need to make a collective decision in a way, which is why I was talking about groups, gelling and becoming much more adept at all of this as the week goes on, because you kind of get to think in the same way. You become a unit together. So what one person thinks is wise may not be what someone else thinks in the group. So you need to try and avoid that at all costs to make sure it's a consensus. But the highway code has not actually changed. What it's actually done is it's made it very clear, this hierarchy of road users. And if it means remaining, and again, I said earlier, I teach bikeability to kids in schools. If it means remaining in the primary position on the road in order to maintain your safety, then that is what you should do. But it takes a level of confidence to do that. I always talk about not being an aggressive bike rider, but being an assertive bike rider. And that's what I think you need to do in those sort of situations. I hope that's answered it.
Yeah, very thorough. Thanks, Andy. So we've got another one here from Paul. So do groups stay together for the whole 9 days? I'm entered on my own and was anticipating that a lot of people chop and change groups every day. Is this not the case?
It does happen, and I think that it's wise for that to happen. One is you might want a different conversation with someone. You might not necessarily want to talk about the same thing day in and day out. Really interesting. We've got 7 groups here this week where we are, and I was just talking to some of the guys, and we were talking about changing the groups tomorrow for that very, very reason, so that people can talk to different people, can get to know different people. So that's one aspect of that. But equally, of course, you might find that the group you're riding with is not strong enough, or it's too strong. And I think that being prepared to change groups and join another group is absolutely fine. But what we do find, we have 25 of my guys who act as chaperones on this, and they're experienced club riders who will be able to help form the groups. There was a time when we tried to get them to form the group, and they almost became Pied Pipers, and we ended up with sort of 25 or 30 riders all lined up behind, a chaperone, which was really, really counterproductive. It wasn't what we were about at all. It was for them to try and help establish groups of the size I've just talked about, and then maybe move on to another group and start another group going. And if that happened at pit stops, if that happened, in the evening over dinner, then that's what I would recommend. So you're right to say people will move between groups. 100% they will. Equally, some groups will come along already formed and be happy to ride together.
That's great. And yeah, I'd probably just add to that, anecdotally, there's so many riders over the years who've kind of come up to us after and said how, there's plenty who are quite nervous about doing it solo and not sure, how they even become part of a group. But you'll find that it does happen naturally. It can be from meeting someone at breakfast or dinner to suddenly, just actually finding that you go out at the same time as this other chap. So it does happen quite naturally. So I'd reassure you guys on that, not to worry too much if it's not happening straight away. And a quick question here, Andy. Some of these I think you've covered already, or perhaps people might have joined late, but always worth just covering it off quickly if you don't mind. A quick one here: should you ride in pairs in a group?
I guess people mean 2 abreast when they're saying that. So I think the answer, I don't think the answer. The answer is yes. We covered off how close you might ride, and the fact that if you're new to group riding, you might find that a little bit of a concern to start with, and people will leave a fair gap. But the key thing is to ride at a distance from someone else that you feel most comfortable with. So whether that's alongside someone or whether that's behind someone, then make sure that you feel comfortable with that space, and make it clear. I keep talking about communication, but make it clear to the rider you're riding next to, if they're coming a bit too close and you don't feel comfortable, let them know. One of the things we do find with group riding, with new people to group riding, is that more often than not, they do feel nervous and do sometimes feel, if they're on the inside and they're sort of second or third wheel, they do feel a bit claustrophobic and a bit hemmed in, and will often move outside the wheel in front, which then pushes the person who's outside them out further into the traffic. And as I said earlier, sometimes if you're in a car or even on the bike and I come behind a group, to a car driver, it looks like you're four abreast, not two abreast. So it's vitally important that, by the end, as I said, by the end of it, we see such improvements that you try and maintain as much discipline to be behind the wheel as you possibly can.
Great. We've got another one from Ben, just asking around chain ganging or dropping off the front.
It's a good question. It's a good question. So chain gang essentially is a group that would be working together at a more workman-like pace. Let's use that phrase. So it would be a group of riders that perhaps a little bit more experienced, let's say. But I've seen plenty of chain gang type rides where the group just gets shredded very, very quickly. So the ideal would be for the group to rotate in the group. So if you've got 8 to 10 rides, as I've talked about, depending on which way the wind's blowing, either the outside line moves up and the riders across change formation. So you're not ending up sitting next to the same person for the whole 100 and whatever it is miles each day, but you actually are talking to different people and you are sharing the workload between that group. So that in effect is an advancement on just riding as a group. And it's an important point that's been made, and perhaps something that I should have covered off earlier. But if you are thinking about that, then it is quite important that you do continue to ride in the formation. Either the outside line moves up and the rider drops across to the left-hand side, the outside right-hand rider moves across the left-hand side, and then in rider number, if I'm going back to my numbers, rider number 4 would move up to become rider number 2. Does that make sense? Rider number 1 would have dropped back to number 3, and you rotate in that way. Or if the wind's from the right-hand side, you rider number 1 would move across to right position number 2. But it's a good point. It's well made. The key thing there, I talked about half wheeling. The key thing there is that when you go to the front, you don't surge to the front, and that you don't increase the speed, because then the other riders all have to increase their speed to try and keep up. And before you know it, it's become a bike race. So, keep the speed constant and a pace that's sustainable for the ride and the riders that are in the group.
Perfect. Well answered, Andy. Thank you. We've got one here from Mark. So what protocol would you like to see when a single rider wishes to join a group on the road for maybe a short duration?
That's a great ask. I think that if a single rider is keen to join a group, and it's out on the road, which is what the question was, then if they've looked over their shoulder and seen the group that's coming, let the group come by and then slot in behind, and then make it clear as the riders are coming by that you're keen to join. One thing I would hope is that everyone's friendly enough to allow that to happen. I think people, there's plenty of snobby cycling clubs out there, where people are a little bit less inclined, let's put it that way. I'm being careful with my language, but less inclined to welcome people into their group. But I would like to think that RAB is a much more inclusive environment, and that we're keen to encourage and welcome people to join groups where we can. So I think that's a great question. I think I would hope that people would be pleased to have an extra bit of firepower potentially in their group, as long as I said earlier, the groups then don't become unwieldy and become too big.
Like it. We've got a great one here from Phil. I'm slow up hills, aren't we all, Phil? I was expecting to get dropped on every long incline. Discouraged.
I don't know whether you froze for everyone then, Will, but it's the last bit about discouraged.
Am I coming through loud and clear now?
You are.
Cool. So I'm slow up hills. I was expecting to get dropped on every long incline and fit into the group behind. Is that discouraged?
No, that's absolutely fine, because you're going to ride with, you're going to go and ride with another group, and ultimately you'll end up with a group that's the right group. So I think I touched on this earlier. There's nothing worse than starting with a group that's a bit too tasty and is riding too hard, and for you to keep trying to race back on. I remember riding an event years and years ago, and there was an old Danish pro who rode the Tour de France many times, and I forget where I was coaching somewhere, and he said that he was criticizing the English particularly, and saying how they always get dropped out of a group but continue to ride, out their skins to try and get back to the group. Whereas the reality is they should just look over their shoulders and ease up a bit and wait for the next group to come along, because then you'll probably find that's where you should have been in the first place. So that should absolutely be encouraged. And be honest with yourself, as I said earlier. That'd be my tip there.
Great. I hope that's reassuring, Phil, and for the rest of us. So we've got another one here, Andy, and stick with me on this one, Andy. It's quite a long one, probably easier to read. You mentioned that when riding two abreast, rider number 1 should increase speed to allow rider number 2 a gap to ride into. However, if there is a car back, should the number 2 rider increase pace as they are on the outside to naturally increase the pace to allow gaps to form on the inside?
Oh, that's a great question.
Good one.
Yeah, that is good. I don't think it really matters, the truth be told, as long as you're not slowing down and creating more of a blockage. That's the key thing. So the example I gave was a car coming towards, and the instinct often is to brake. The front riders brake. If you're nervous, the front riders brake, and then actually everybody brakes. If the car's coming from behind, which is the good question, then I don't think it matters so much which rider goes forward, as long as there's a gap for the other riders to fall into. But you're reliant then 100% on the message coming from the back in time for the front rider to speed up to allow those gaps to be created, if that makes sense. Yeah. So again, it's what that demonstrates is absolutely about the calls being clear and concise, and heard and passed up the line.
Brilliant. Got a couple of ones here from Chris. So, do you ensure groups go out each day at intervals and are not too big? And also, do you encourage slower groups to go out first?
That's another great question. So we run this strike system that you'll be aware of, and so if you've been a late finisher the day before, then there is a fast track to the front of the group in the morning. So we would, if anybody is that I don't like to use the word slow, but steady, and they are in that situation, then it's good to get out, to get yourself warmed up, to get out on the road, and then to naturally form the groups as happens, as you've already alluded to, Will. We will allow riders to go in groups of around about 40 or 50, and then leave a couple of minutes between each group going off to allow the groups or the riders to spread out. Often, if people are in groups, and we've got to rider number 40 and there's another sort of 3 and their mates are just in front, of course, we'll let them go, because it's much better that they get away and ride together as their group, rather than them stopping around the corner and waiting for their riders to come and catch up with them, or for them to cause sort of disruption to any of the other riders as they start to speed up to try and catch their mates, or vice versa. So we'll accommodate group riding as much as we possibly can, but the start process is pretty straightforward. It's 40 to 50 riders going out a couple of minute intervals, and once you're out on the road, the groups start to form, and if you've already formed your groups, then you will be allowed to go off as that group.
Perfect. And one here from Tom. So, is there an etiquette to how long people take turns on the front, not having wheel suckers in a group, etc.?
Well, again, that's a really good question. So there's nothing worse than being a really strong rider who is able to just plow along on the front, and you've just got a load of people sat on your wheel, benefiting from your effort, and then towards the end they leave you, or they decide that there's a better wheel come past and they jump on that wheel, and you've been working hard to help them. So I think that would always be discouraged in my book. You'd always try and make sure that the pace was being shared where possible. But I think it comes back to what I said earlier, that if you physically can't go through and can't do your turn, then make it clear to that rider that you're really struggling. So they have a choice to make. Then they're either going to accept that as a reason that you can't help them, or they're going to ride away and leave you. So I think there is an etiquette, and I think you just need to be honest with each other. So if people are really struggling, but they're benefiting, and if you're feeling generous and you're of spirit and you're happy for them to be there, then that's fine. Let them know that. But equally, if you're not, then make them know that as well, or if you want them to come in a polite as way as possible, of course.
Right. And then we got one here from Sarah, and I know, Andy, you mentioned about the chaperones and their role, and how what we don't want it to be is Pied Pipers and groups of huge groups following them around. But they are there for a reason. And Sarah's kind of asked the question around giving a bit more detail around their role, with particular focus on group riding. Yeah,
Right.
For that one.
Great question. So we've been providing the chaperones all the time we've done RAB, and they have three roles really. There's two or three sort of faster guys who I'll put towards the front, and their role's more of a sort of a policeman type role, because we're all aware that there's a few headbangers out there that want to sort of ride hard, and we want to make sure that those guys are riding sensibly and they're not taking any unnecessary risks. So that's sort of their role. And then there's a few riders chaperones who will ride at the back, and their role is really about encouragement and about making sure that some of the people who are really struggling are offered a wheel, are helped. And when I say offered a wheel, I mean to give them some shelter and provide them some shelter from the headwinds or whatever it might be. But the majority of the chaperones will be in the middle of the pack, and they will be there primarily to help form these groups and hopefully act as sort of mentors, stroke coaches to get these groups going. And we're also conscious that there's plenty of other experienced club riders taking part in this lovely challenge, and they can equally fulfill that role. So it's about making sure their experience, their knowledge is there to help create the groups, to make sure that they're if the groups start to get too big, maybe forming a second group, just making sure that if there's any mechanicals, they can help sort that out. But generally being an experienced, knowledgeable person that can help in these sort of situations in terms of creating groups and monitoring and helping the groups to succeed.
Love it. Thanks, Andy. A really good question here from Tim, and probably one that I'd be asking. What is the expectation of the other group riders if you have a technical issue such as a puncture?
So it is a good question, and particularly when you don't know people so well. So the etiquette generally would be that the group would stop because you're a unit, you're riding together. However, that's generally when a group is fairly tight knit and everyone knows everybody. So if I was out with my club, for example, that's how we would operate. I think that if people don't know other people, then there might be a tendency to push on. I would hope that people, and we've seen it, we've witnessed it on RAB. I hope that these groups do form and that friendships form. People do stop and help each other out, and that's another place where the chaperones will come in useful, because if they can help get someone back on the road quickly, they will do that rather than calling the mechanic or something out. But in my book, if you're riding as a unit, and you've got a good, well-established unit, then for me, you should all, if someone punches or someone has a mechanical, you should all stop and help each other out and make sure that you're back on the road as a unit again. I think that's sort of how I would expect it to operate, but I'm conscious that it doesn't always work that way.
Okay, so we've got a couple more questions now. We've probably got time for our final few. So if you do have a question for Andy, please do get them in now. This is probably the question of the night, actually, and I think the most important one of the lot, from David. I was told there would be no wind. Is Andy saying there will be headwinds?
No, we're gonna get a southwesterly for the first 2 days. Then we're gonna get a southerly for a few days, and then when we get to Betty Hill, we'll have a westerly to blow us into John O'Groats. I think it's the point about this event is we've got to be prepared for all weathers. We've had all weathers. We've had incredible tailwinds. We've had incredible headwinds. We've had incredible rain. We've had amazingly hot sunshine. When you're taking on a challenge like this, you've got to be prepared to ride in all those conditions. But it is a good question, because when it does have an impact on group riding, because if people haven't got mud guards on, for example, there's spray to contend with in your face. You might want to leave a little bit more room because you putting your brakes on takes a little bit longer. We very experienced riders, if there's a crosswind, will slightly overlap the wheel. They'll just give this. I used the term earlier. It's an echelon. If you watch any of the Belgian races, more recently the classics, if there's a wind from the side, you need to shelter just slightly off the wheel of the rider in front, so that you're just getting the best advantage you possibly can from that. So sadly, there might be a headwind, but I can't promise you there won't be.
That was the best detailed question and answer to a jokey question, Andy. Love it. Final one here looks like from Chris. So how will the chaperone be identifiable? So Yeah, they're in kit. You can't miss them. Got chaperone on the back. What colour are they in now, Andy?
Well, I'm not sure. There was talk about them being changed, wasn't there? The current jersey has got Threshold and Chaperone written on the back, and it's black and green jersey, and it does stand out particularly well. So I'm sure that we will put a picture up of the jersey if it were to change, but that's the current colours.
Perfect. And then a final one, do you release a daily weather and wind report every evening?
We do indeed. So we will check that out. That will have an impact each day. So yeah, when we do the evening brief, normally about 8 o'clock, I'll go through the following day stage, any important aspects that we need to be aware of, or anything that's happened with the route team will have gone out that day and put the arrows up. They'll have reported back to me, and we'll also add the weather forecasting. So we'll be well prepared for the following day's riding, for sure.
So yeah, timing, we're looking spot on. I mean, just to give perhaps one or two final chance to get the last question in, is there kind of any question, Andy, that hasn't been asked yet, that is a kind of typical one that tends to come up all the time? Would you feel like we've covered quite a lot? Is there anything that you'd say is outstanding?
No, I think we've covered pretty much everything. I think there's, as I said at the start, I think there's a lot of mystique surrounding group riding. I think some people overthink it. I think that it's about just having a decent ride with your mates, and if you can find a group of like-minded souls who share some, whatever the banter might be, but you share some sort of experience together, then that's the key to it. And the fact that you then find it's more enjoyable and pleasurable riding, and you're being more efficient, and that you're saving energy, those are the most important things about riding a group. But equally, we're aware, as I said earlier, that people find that they want to ride on their own, and that's just as good. It's just, all we wanted to do is make sure that people understood the benefits from group riding with this webinar, and hopefully we've done that for you.
Brilliant. Right, I think that brings it to a close. Thanks so much, Andy, for going through all of that in so much detail and answering everyone's questions, and thanks to everyone for putting forward those questions. Super helpful, and even I'm learning about it, and this will be my probably 6th RAB, I think. And thank you to Sophie for making it all run so smoothly. But yeah, that brings it to a close. Thanks everyone for dialing in. Please do make use of the resources available to you. And please do give us a call as well. We're a friendly team based in the heart of Brighton. If you're ever about, fancy a coffee and fancy chatting all things cycling, please do let us know. Equally, if you've got any question at all, we've got the team on hand to help you. So I guess that's it, and we'll see you at the start line in September, if not before.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.